Hi guys, this is Andrew Rupe, Golden Harvest Agronomist in Wisconsin. Coming at you today to provide you a little training material as part of the Golden Harvest Agronomy team's Insight training courses. The topic of today's training revolves around early season field scouting of soybeans. The outline of the agenda we're going to go through is going to be covering 4 primary points. We're going to start with stand establishment. Next we'll move on to soybean growth staging. The third point will be on soybean nodulation. And then the final topic will be an overview of some of the different pests and pathogen pressures we can be monitoring here in the early season. I just want to quickly touch on the importance of getting out to our customers' fields and scouting their fields. Providing this service to our customers is really at the heart of our Service 365 initiative. This helps to represent to our customers that there really is more value in what we can provide to them other than just what's in the bag of seed we sell to them. All right, let's get going. So the first topic we're going to cover is under stand establishment and measuring soybean population within the field. Achieving an appropriate and desired soybean crop stand really helps us to set the stage for the yield potential. It helps us to evaluate what the current stand is, and also helps to evaluate the conditions surrounding planting. Do we have that nice even emergence within our crop, or do we see a lot of gaps and skips, or even unevenness in the growth of our soybean plants? We don't like to see them fall too many leaf stages behind, but soybeans are a lot more flexible whenever we compare that to corn, where falling leaf stages behind in corn is much more disadvantage to the corn. So when we think about what the highest yield potential for soybeans would be, we typically think around 140 to 150,000 plants per acre is the optimal yield potential, at least the seeding rate. I should restate that. However, soybeans are very flexible in their ability to put on more pods at lower populations, and on the opposite end, they're actually able to self-thin themselves at higher populations. We'll actually see soybeans somewhat become barren in certain spots, just to help self-thin themselves down to somewhere around that 100,000 plants per acre in many cases. So when we want to the actual process of determining what the plant population is, there's a very handy calculator that the University of Wisconsin's created that you can put on your iPhone or your iPad, and it tells you what the distance to measure should be based upon what your row spacing is for the particular field. It tells you to measure out a certain distance, count the number of plants, multiply it by 1,000, and multiply it by the number of rows based upon that row spacing, and then it gives you your current plant population. One thing I'd like to stress is making sure that we're taking these counts and these measurements on multiple areas of the field. And with that covers soybean stand establishment and soybean plant population. This next topic I wanted to cover covers soybean growth staging. The importance of understanding the true soybean growth stage within a field is to evaluate what's actually going on within the physiology of that soybean crop. Another key aspect of understanding the true growth stage is knowing where we're at for some of the crop protection products that we may consider using, whether that be herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, anything like that. It's important to know that so that we know that we're not going off label with our crop. So the first growth stage that we'll see come out of the ground is the VE growth stage, and that's whenever that hypocotyl, that first shoot basically is poked up through the surface, and then those first cotyledons have popped up and they've hooked out. So at that point, that growing point is above ground, and with that comes some concerns for physical damage from hail or frost damage, because we can kill that crop once that growing point's out of the surface. We saw that in some areas of the country. Luckily for us in Wisconsin, those earlier planted soybean fields we didn't have the heat, and they actually stayed below ground, and we ended up in pretty good shape whenever we had that Mother's Day frost. The next stage would be the VC growth stage, and that's whenever the first true leaves, those first 2 unifoliate leaves have come out and they're opposing each other, and that's that VC growth stage. At that point, the plant is no longer relying solely on the energy from the seed. Now it's able to actually use photosynthesis to provide energy to sustain the plant. The next stage would be the V1 growth stage. That is whenever we see the first trifoliate leaves come out, unroll, and are no longer touching each other. This is an important growth stage because at this point we can start seeing some axillary bud development within the plant. Axillary buds are essential to the plant because they provide an extra growing point on the plant in case we have any of those damaging hail events or destructive events that could physically damage the crop. Those axillary buds will provide an extra growing point on the crop. The next stage would be the V2 growth stage. This is whenever the second trifoliate leaves have come out, unrolled, and are no longer touching each other. And this is a really critical point in the physiology of the soybean plant, because this is whenever nodulation is really starting to ramp up within the plant. Nodulation is the plant's symbiotic relationship with the bacteria in the soil, where it can actually fix its own nitrogen and supply the nitrogen that crop needs. So we'll typically see about a leaf stage every 5 to 7 days early in the season. Those are under typical late spring, early summer growing conditions. That 5 to 7 days then speeds up to about every 3 to 5 days for vegetative growth once we hit the reproductive stage, once we hit floral development. So the unique thing about our part of the country is that we grow indeterminate soybeans here in the Midwest. That's opposed to determinate soybeans, which are grown in the southern US. Indeterminate soybeans have a overlapping vegetative and reproductive growth stage. So indeterminate soybeans they'll continue vegetative growth even after floral development has been initiated. In determinate soybeans that are grown in the southern US, there's a definitive line where they have vegetative growth, and then once reproductive stage begins, there's no more vegetative growth. That's similar to what we see in corn, where there's a definitive start and stop to vegetative growth, and then a start and stop to reproductive growth. With that, I think that covers soybean growth stage development. The next subject I wanted to cover deals with soybean nodulation. And the importance of soybean nodulation is that this is the plant's ability to fix its own nitrogen from the atmosphere. Many people think since we don't apply nitrogen to our soybean crop, the soybeans don't really use or need nitrogen. That's really not the case. Soybeans actually use an enormous amount of nitrogen for their crop. They actually use 4 times the rate per bushel that corn uses. They typically use around 3.8 pounds per bushel of nitrogen to support the crop. So what that means is, say you have a 70 bushel per acre soybean crop. That means that crop will need somewhere around 230 to 270 pounds of nitrogen per acre to feed that crop. However, they are able to feed themselves through this symbiotic relationship with the rhizobia bacteria in the soil. We want to check nodulation around that V2 growth stage. We can usually start seeing some nodules around V1, but around V2 to V3, we'll actually be able to break those nodules open and check the color of those nodules. Healthy nodulation will have a pinkish reddish color on within those nodules. Unhealthy nodules will have more of a pale white green color inside those nodules. So it's important to not only check for nodulation, but also to pull those up and split those nodules open and make sure that they're the appropriate color. With that, that covers soybean nodulation. The last topic I wanted to cover goes into detail on some of the different pests that we may encounter early in the season in our soybean fields, whether that be insects, fungal pathogens, or weeds. Usually each soybean field will see one of those that we may encounter earlier in the season. One of the biggest insects that we see early in the season may be bean leaf beetles. Bean leaf beetles typically will chew out an irregular hole in between the veins of the soybean leaves. We can see this a lot in a lot of early planted soybean fields. We had some early planting this year across the state. Some of those early fields that are planted early by a couple miles may start to see some bean leaf feeding earlier in the season. It's typically not necessarily an economic damage earlier in the season, but it does provide some insight as to what the future pressure may be throughout the season, because bean leaf beetles will have up to 3 generations each year in our geography. So it may be valuable to scout for those and consider using an insecticide in our post-emerge herbicide program. Another insect may be cutworms. We could see some stand reductions from cutworms this year. DATCAP has reported significantly higher cutworm flights this early this season. It's unlikely to cause severe stand loss where replanting would be concerned, but it's something to monitor earlier in the season. Fungal pathogens are important earlier in the season too. We planted maybe into some cooler soils where Pythium may be a little bit more of a concern, especially if those soils were wet. And some of the other diseases that we could see come about would be Rhizoctonia or Phytophthora earlier in the season. Those two fungal pathogens typically prefer a little bit warmer temperatures around planting time. But all 3 of them combined, they all have one condition that they all like, and that's moisture. And if we planted into wetter conditions or we had excessive moisture near after planting, that will be a breeding ground for some of those fungal pathogens. So what we're looking for is some of the dampening off of younger plants. And we'll see plants that are wilted, yellowed, and basically near death, surrounded by potentially healthy plants. And that's a good indication of one of those 3 fungal pathogens getting up into that plant and causing plant death. And the last thing we want to scout for is weeds. And we want to try to provide a little bit of an indication as to what the weed pressure may be within the fields. Do we see grasses within the field? Do we see broadleaves? What broadleaves are we seeing? Or what's the weed diversity within the field, and what's the pressure? If we're unsure of what the weed species is, be sure to take multiple pictures and consult your local chemical rep. With that, I greatly appreciate all of you taking the time to view this video today. I hope some of these topics will come in handy as you're out scouting your fields and your customers' fields. And as always, please reach out to myself if you have any questions or concerns. Thanks, guys.